It began with a letter, a single page, folded once, written in careful, trembling handwriting. No return address, no signature, only the faint scent of smoke and the smudge of a fingerprint pressed against the corner, as if the author had been interrupted mid-thought. When it was found, months after the guns had gone silent, the war was already over. At least, that's what everyone thought. But history, real history, doesn't end with treaties or signatures. It ends with people. And this letter was the last voice of a man the world had already forgotten. It was discovered in the ruins of a military post on the edge of a destroyed city, inside a dented metal box next to a watch stopped at 11:54 and a handful of dog tags burned black. The soldier who found it thought it was just another piece of paper lost to the chaos. But when intelligence officers read it, everything changed. Because the letter wasn't just a farewell. It was a confession, a plea, and, in its own strange way, a weapon. No one knows who wrote it. Some said it came from a prisoner, an officer held deep inside an enemy camp, writing not to escape, but to end something far larger than himself. Others claimed it was forged, a piece of psychological warfare sent to break what little will remained in the enemy command. Yet the facts that followed are undeniable. Within 48 hours of that letter reaching its destination, entire divisions stopped moving. An offensive halted, and a ceasefire, one that should have taken months, was suddenly on the table. Even decades later, historians would argue over its origin. Some said it was intercepted. Others believed it had been deliberately delivered, hand-carried through smoke and ruins by someone who never made it back. What they all agreed on, however, was this: that letter saved lives. And it killed the man who wrote it. No radio transmission, no coded telegram could have done what one piece of paper did. Because this wasn't an order. It was an act of mercy disguised as surrender, written by someone who had seen too much to believe in victory anymore. The handwriting itself told a story, measured, steady, but uneven near the end. The ink darkened as if pressed harder into the page with each word. A soldier's script someone used to control but breaking under the weight of what he knew. What did it say? That remains the question no one can answer completely. Most of the text was lost, destroyed in translation or hidden in archives. But the fragments that survived spoke of regret and warning. If you receive this, then know that the fire must stop. We have burned everything that was meant to be saved. And under that, in faint, slanted letters, a final line: I was never your enemy. They called him the Ghost in Block 7. No one knew his real name. To the guards, he was just another prisoner with the quiet discipline of a soldier. One who saluted even when no one was watching. He rarely spoke. He never complained. And every night, when the rest of the camp fell into the uneasy silence of captivity, he sat beneath the dim bulb above his cot, writing. Always writing. Pages that no one saw, lines that vanished as soon as the ink dried. Some believed he was a captured officer. Others thought he was a code specialist, one of those men who could turn words into weapons. The rumors grew like vines in the dark, that he'd once commanded a battalion, that he'd defied his superiors, that he'd refused to carry out an order so horrific it had cost him everything. No one dared to ask. Even the guards, hardened by years of war, avoided his eyes. But one man noticed him, an interpreter assigned to monitor correspondence, a young lieutenant barely out of school. He described the prisoner later in his diary. He looked like someone who had already accepted his death, not as punishment, but as necessity. Every morning, the interpreter saw new pages neatly stacked beside the cot, folded twice, sealed with a strip of cloth torn from the prisoner's uniform. No envelope, no address, just a single word scrawled on the outside, "To the living." The guards didn't take it seriously at first. They thought it was poetry, a confession, or madness. Until one evening, the interpreter broke the rules and began to translate one of the letters. What he read shook him. It wasn't a plea for freedom or food. It was a record, names, places, dates, evidence of something that had happened far from the front lines. A massacre that no one had ever reported. The kind of truth that could bury nations. The prisoner wrote not to be forgiven, but to make sure it could never happen again. Every sentence was deliberate, as if he knew time was running out. He wrote about civilians trapped between two armies, about orders signed in rooms where no blood was spilled, and about the silence that followed. By the time the interpreter finished the letter, his hands were shaking. He realized this wasn't just history. It was confession turned into rebellion. The next morning, the prisoner was gone. The cot was empty, the bulb still swinging. On the table lay one unfinished page with a final line. "Tell them the war ended long before the surrender." The interpreter never spoke of it publicly, but years later, when archives opened, his name appeared on the document transfer logs. He had been the one who carried the last surviving letter across enemy lines. That act, one soldier defying orders to deliver another man's truth, would become the spark behind one of the most mysterious decisions ever made in wartime diplomacy. Because within weeks, ceasefire negotiations accelerated, a campaign halted, and somewhere between intelligence briefings and intercepted messages, that letter reached its mark. The letter left the prison in a way no one could ever explain. There was no courier, no guard bribed, no secret tunnel. But weeks later it appeared, on the desk of an officer in a command center miles away, folded neatly, still carrying the faint smell of damp stone and candle smoke. The officer who opened it was young, too young to have seen the full brutality of the war. He read it once, then twice. Then he locked his door and sat in silence for nearly an hour, because the words were not meant for him. And yet they spoke directly to his conscience. The letter began with no greeting, no rank, no pretense, just a sentence written in precise, deliberate script. "If you read this, then you're alive, and that makes you responsible." The rest was a mixture of confession and command, lines that blurred between the personal and the political. It described villages erased from maps, soldiers buried in fields where no one would ever build monuments, and decisions made not from strategy, but from fear. The author wrote not as a man serving his country, but as one betrayed by it. He spoke of an operation never acknowledged, one designed to prolong the fighting long after surrender was possible. It was, in essence, a plea to stop what should have ended months earlier, a desperate attempt to save the few who still could be saved. You believe in orders. I believe in them once. But orders are written by men who never see what they destroy. The officer trembled as he read the next part, a series of coordinates, dates, and names. Each one matched classified operations scheduled to launch within the coming days. If the letter was real, thousands would die unnecessarily. If it was fake, believing it could mean treason. He didn't know which terrified him more. At the bottom of the final page, the author had written, "I am not asking for mercy. I am asking for an ending." The handwriting ended abruptly, as if interrupted mid-sentence. The last word trailed into a smear of ink, or blood. By dawn, copies of the letter were already circulating through intelligence channels. It had become a ghost, untraceable, yet impossible to ignore. Each translation shifted its tone slightly. In one version, it was an accusation. In another, a warning. But every officer who read it felt the same thing, a quiet, undeniable weight pressing on their chest. Something about it felt true. One colonel described the feeling years later. It wasn't propaganda. It wasn't desperation. It was clarity, like someone had finally said what we were all afraid to admit. 2 days later, the offensive it described was called off, officially, due to logistical complications. Unofficially, because no one wanted to risk proving the letter right. The message that shouldn't have existed, that wasn't supposed to leave that cell, had done the impossible. It had crossed enemy lines, pierced command silence, and rewritten the rules of surrender. And somewhere in a cold cell, the man who wrote it, whether alive or already gone, had finally ended his war. By the time the letter reached the capital, it no longer belonged to the man who wrote it. It had been read, copied, translated, and dissected until only fragments of its meaning remained. Yet its power seemed to grow with every retelling. In a dim office buried beneath the Ministry of Defense, a group of men gathered around the pile of intercepted correspondence. Thousands of letters from prisoners, soldiers, civilians. Most were filled with silence, apologies, fear, longing. But one stood out. A single page, unsigned, its ink faded but legible, stamped with no insignia, marked only by the number 7. An intelligence officer placed it on the desk, between two reports stamped classified. He spoke quietly, as if afraid the words might burn. "We don't know who wrote it, but whoever did, they knew things they shouldn't." The letter contained details that no prisoner should have known: troop movements, code names, locations of supply routes, all of it accurate. But what unsettled the men in the room wasn't the precision, it was the tone. The writer wasn't trying to warn, accuse, or threaten. He was trying to end something. He wrote as if appealing not to a government, but to conscience itself. "War," one general murmured, rereading a line, "is not a command. It's a choice, repeated by those too afraid to stop." For a moment, the room fell silent. Outside, the city still echoed with air raid sirens and distant artillery. Inside, the men stared at the page that seemed to strip away everything they'd been taught to believe. The oldest among them, a veteran of 2 wars, folded his hands and whispered, "If this is genuine, it's treason. But if it's true, it's history." No one dared to decide which was worse. Over the next few hours, the letter was sent upward through chain after chain of command until it reached the highest desks. Politicians read it, then diplomats, then men whose names never appeared in the newspapers but whose signatures could start or end entire wars. In the process, it became something else: a tool, a mirror, a weapon wrapped in humanity. New versions began to appear, redrafted, repurposed, quoted in speeches that called for compassionate surrender or the end of senseless loss. Newspapers hinted at a message from within the camps. Propaganda leaflets borrowed its words, but no one mentioned its author. The man who had written the letter had vanished from the story entirely. His words survived, but his voice was gone. In one particularly ironic twist, a politician even cited the letter publicly as proof of his own righteousness, saying, "Even the enemy now recognizes the futility of this war." But those who had seen the original knew that wasn't true. The letter didn't belong to one side or the other. It belonged to everyone caught in between. And though it was copied, altered, and manipulated, the original message remained buried deep in its folds. That a single conscience, unarmed and unseen, can shake the machinery of destruction more than any bomb. It would take decades for historians to uncover fragments of the original, hidden in archives mislabeled or burned. But the myth of the prisoner's letter had already taken root. Some saw it as propaganda, others as confession, but those who read it closely felt something else, a silence that spoke louder than any speech. By the time the letter reached the war room, it had already become more than a document. It was an infection, quiet, invisible, but impossible to stop. Each new reader caught something from it, a pause in their voice, a tremor in their hand, a shadow in their eyes. No one could trace how it had arrived. No courier admitted to carrying it. No file recorded its delivery. But there it was, folded neatly, placed on the long oak table between reports on fuel shortages and casualty counts. The men who gathered around it were not sentimental. They were officers, hardened by years of maps, codes, and losses. They'd seen surrender, starvation, executions, and learned to speak of all of it as necessary outcomes. But as they began to read, something cracked. "This wasn't written by a soldier," one of them murmured. "It was written by someone who's already seen too much." The letter didn't accuse. It didn't plead. It simply described, with terrifying calm, what happens when obedience outlives purpose. It spoke of orders that no longer had meaning, of men who fought because silence felt worse than death. It spoke of children who would grow up thinking ashes were snow. For the first time in months, none of the men spoke. The colonel in charge, a man whose ribbons could cover his entire chest, read it twice, then a third time. He had built his career on loyalty, on the belief that hesitation was weakness. But as his eyes reached the end of the page, something inside him shifted. The last line read, "If we cannot stop the war, we can at least stop pretending it makes us men." He folded the paper slowly, like a fragile thing, and placed it in his breast pocket. No one dared to ask what he was thinking. When the meeting ended, he stayed behind. The lights dimmed. The clock ticked on. He poured himself a glass of cold coffee and stared at the maps covering the wall. Red lines advancing, black crosses marking lost divisions. He'd memorized those lines for years, but tonight, for the first time, they looked less like strategy and more like scars. He took out the letter again. His eyes drifted over each sentence, over the uneven handwriting, over the smudges where ink had mixed with sweat. Then he noticed something he hadn't seen before. On the back of the last page, faint pencil marks, as if written in haste. They said silence keeps us safe. They were wrong. Silence only keeps us guilty. It wasn't part of the original letter. Someone along the way had added it. Maybe another reader, maybe another conscience awakened too late. Outside, thunder rolled. Somewhere in the distance, artillery fired one more round. Automatic, pointless, routine. The colonel didn't move. By dawn, the letter had vanished from the archives. In its place lay a blank envelope, labeled only, "For those who still believe in victory." No one confessed to removing it. No one even mentioned it. But within a week, everything began to slow down. Convoys rerouted, operations delayed. Commanders hesitated at their desks, reading and rereading every order twice. Officially, it was called a communication disruption. Unofficially, a crisis of conscience. Historians later traced those strange interruptions across several armies. It wasn't sabotage, it wasn't espionage. It was doubt, spreading faster than any message. One intelligence report described it simply: morale has collapsed, not from defeat, but from recognition. Recognition that one man in a prison cell had written what millions had only dared to think, that even the smallest act of truth could unravel an empire's will to fight, and that the war, that machine of obedience and fear, had finally met something it couldn't crush: a single, honest voice. The colonel who last held the letter disappeared that same month. His office was sealed, his name removed from internal records. But one clerk, decades later, found a torn memo buried in an old box of declassified files. It was unsigned. It contained only 3 words. He read it twice. The room was silent except for the sound of pens scratching across paper. Outside, cameras clicked, lights flickered, and history, for once, didn't roar, but whispered. No speeches, no cheers, just signatures. The letter that had once passed through so many hands now lay in the folder of one of the men at the table, folded, creased, almost forgotten, yet its words had already done their work. Armies had stopped, minds had changed, and now the war that was never supposed to end was ending not with explosions, but with ink. Across from the officers sat the interpreters, exhausted and pale. They had spent days translating words that could reshape borders. But among all the phrases, surrender, occupation, ceasefire, none felt as heavy as the silence that followed. One general, whose uniform still carried the dust of the front, stared at the document in front of him for a long time before signing. When his pen finally touched the paper, his hand didn't shake, but his eyes did. "It's strange," he murmured, "to end something that no one truly won." No one answered. In the corner of the room, a clerk carefully sealed the last copy of the treaty. Inside the same folder, he found a single loose sheet, aged, folded many times. He almost threw it away. But before he did, he noticed something handwritten on the bottom. If words can start wars, perhaps words can end them too. He slipped the page back inside, between the official documents, where it would remain, unseen, uncredited, but alive. The war ended that day, at least on paper, but the letter's echo carried far beyond the walls of that room. In cities rebuilt from ash, people would one day find fragments of it quoted in newspapers, textbooks, and speeches, though no one remembered who had written them. And somewhere, in a small cell long since abandoned, the air still held the ghost of a man who had dared to write what no one else could. The soldier who read it twice was gone. The generals who feared it were gone. But the letter, the prisoner's quiet rebellion, had done what armies could not. It had ended a war